Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Expect to start hearing the word semi-quincentennial with greater frequency as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There will be parades, fireworks, battle reenactments, and people riding horses in Paul Revere costumes. I'm sure the event will be framed as how exceptional America is, defeating the Brits and all. No more kings. But there's a lot more to the story. It sparked a global war, forced migrations, toppled social hierarchies, and shifted the world's balance of power. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We are here with Dr. Richard Bell, historian, and we were just before you got on, we're talking about how much we absolutely love your book, which we'll mention in a little bit. But so I hope we don't fawn too much over you as a guest, but we're big fans.
Thanks very much.
And you're in Maryland, right? Right now?
Correct. I'm coming to you today from my office in College Park in the History Department at University of Maryland.
Okay, well, let me give you a little bit of background. You are a historian, a remarkable historian, one of our better early American historians. Went to Cambridge, got your BA there with high degree, high honors. You were one of those kids that screwed up the bell-shaped curve when teachers were grading on the curve. And then went to Harvard and picked up a master's and a PhD, specializing in history. Your dissertation was "Do Not Despair, the Cultural Significance of Suicide in America from 1780 to 1840. You've got to tell me a little bit about that dissertation.
I can tell you about 500 pages worth about that. So be careful what you ask for here. Thanks, guys, for having me on. I'm really delighted to be here to chat with you about this new book. But yeah, my first book was based on my dissertation, my PhD thesis, and it was pretty long and pretty sort of highfalutin, and it definitely was aimed at graduate students and faculty members to show them all how smart I was, right? All the big words I knew, all the research I'd done, and it was a investigation of the cultural significance of suicide in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War. And what that means is it wasn't really about counting how many people might have made that desperate choice, or trying to know with any certainty why any individual did that. I think that's often unknowable and difficult to count, by the way. But it was about what people in the past thought about suicide, what they felt about suicide, why they tried to fight it, why they tried to stop it, why they feared it, fundamentally. So I use suicide as sort of a lens to look at other anxieties, political anxieties, social anxieties, the disintegration of the family, whether our kids are, getting weird, more immoral messages from reading pulpy novels, whether we can ever prevent suicide by dragging people out of rivers, lakes, and streams and resuscitating them. Can life-saving be achieved in our lifetime? Can we play God? That sort of thing. And also the use of depictions of enslaved people committing suicide among abolitionists trying to get, white middle-class readers to give a damn about the suffering of black people under slavery, for instance. So interesting topics, but all bundled through this very depressing lens of suicide. No wonder that first book was not a bestseller.
Well, you pick up that theme with your three previous books. First, of course, the 2012 "We Shall Be No More: Suicide and Self-Government." Also in 2012, "Buried Lives: Incarcerated in Early America," and that kind of leads into your book, boys.
Yeah, that's Paddy Cannon in my most recent book until this one. Yeah. So you're right about that, Pat. There are some themes that emerge in my career, often around dark topics, a relationship of sort of people and power, I guess. And so, yeah, I edited a collection of essays by other scholars about the experience of incarceration. That's my book, Buried Lives, edited with a friend of mine. And then I wrote a book that came out in, 2018 called Stolen: 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery and their astonishing odyssey home. And that's a true story, an adventure story, a tragedy and a triumph in which 5 black boys are kidnapped from downtown Philly in 1825 by a gang of professional people snatchers who make their living selling free black kids into Southern slavery. If you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, where an adult man is kidnapped and sold into the Deep South, this is a true story about 5 children, the youngest of whom was 8 years old. And in this particular case, everything went wrong for the kidnappers, I'm pleased to say. And some of these boys managed to survive this brutal ordeal and fight their way back to freedom and their family back in Philadelphia. So I hope people go look at that book. I'm hugely proud of that book, Stolen.
That one seems like that's waiting for an HBO miniseries for sure.
That's right. Tell Oprah when you see her.
Well,
We have her on, yeah.
hey, this was so much fun. The American Revolution, The Fate of the World, your new book. It is timely because we're going to be hearing more about the 250-year anniversary of our founding than we, I think, want to hear. And what I enjoyed so much about it is that I thought I knew a lot about this, and I just didn't know squat after I read your book, which is a great feeling. I don't know.
Put
Greg,
that on the back of the book, the blurb, right? I didn't know squat till I read this book.
I'll blurb your next book. I didn't know squat until I read this book. I don't know, Greg. How did the book strike you?
Well, there's going to be every account about the American Revolution you can imagine going forward, and from 1619, which that whole interest around slavery and its relationship to the American Revolution. We had authors on who discussed that, all the way, every imaginable thing. And of course, there's the mythology that we all grew up with. We, not you, but Pat and I, in high school, about how wonderful and brilliant it was. But I think the narrative you give complexes everything. So we have all these people that are going to be trying to steal the revolution and say this is what it really was about. It was really about this. It was really about slavery. It was really about, but your book complexes that. And that's what I like so much about it. It says, wait a minute, stop. This is a very complex concept that affected the entire world. And I think I'm reminded, I read a book on a different anniversary of the revolution. What would be the last one? 200 years? I don't know, in the 70s. Eric Hobsbawm. And he minimized the revolution. He, in fact, said, well, the U.S. Revolution really didn't amount to much. It didn't affect the rest of the world to any great extent the way the French Revolution did. So, everybody had a flag that was similar to the French flag, but nobody copied the U.S. flag except for Liberia and so on and so forth. Your account, on the other hand, maximizes it, says, look, it had an incredible impact upon the rest of the world. And I think that's really a useful narrative to go into this anniversary where everyone is going to be fighting, from Ken Burns to whoever, for their particular version of what this means, what this revolution means. And so in your case, we've got a host of things to choose from about what it means. Mm-hmm. It meant all those things.
Yeah, I am definitely here to sort of plant a flag and say one new way, one important way, one overdue way to think about the American Revolution is as a global fight, as a global struggle, an episode of global entanglement. There's never American history separate from world history. It was deeply embedded from the start.
And I think that's the new theme of the Ken Burns series too, that he's picking up on that, saying this was not just a tax rebellion that kind of sparked 13 colonies saying no to King George. This was a huge, big, global phenomenon, and that's the theme of your book too. I don't know, where do we start? You want to start with the tea rebellion, and what's with tea and the Brits? I mean, you guys have a real thing for that, and that's apparent in your book, as you mentioned that too.
Yeah, we should get my mother in here. She definitely has a thing for tea. I'll tell you that right now. And so do I as well, to be honest. I love a cup of tea. In fact, normally this time of day, we're in the early afternoon. This is exactly when I nip out to grab a cup of tea. So it's deeply ingrained in the British sort of cultural codes. And I would say back in the era of the American Revolution, but tea has become deeply ingrained in American culture as well. American colonists love tea in the 1770s. They're drinking mountains of it. Ironically, they're getting a lot of it from smuggled sources they're not really supposed to, like Dutch suppliers who are outside the free trade zone of the British Empire. And that's caused some consternation in London, and especially among the leaders of the British East India Company, which is the global mega corporation with close ties to the British government, which has been sort of Britain's wholesale importer of tea from the Fujian Mountains, where black tea is grown, via the great port of Canton, which is now Guangzhou in China. And the British East India Company would like nothing more but to break into the American consumer market rather than just be the wholesaler in Britain. But it's confronted by tea smuggling from Dutch suppliers. John Hancock, by the way, who's definitely not Dutch, definitely does a bit of tea smuggling with the Dutch. And so the 1773 Tea Act is an effort by the British government to give the East India Company several things it wants and several things it needs, one of which is an emergency bailout, by the way. But the terms of that bailout allow the British East India Company to penetrate the American consumer market for tea in a way it's not been allowed to do before as a wholesaler. And that directly challenges anyone involved in smuggling Dutch tea, whether that be John Hancock and Americans like him, whether that be American consumers who are just used to getting tea from where they're used to getting it from. And so we see that backlash against the East India Company's entry into the American retail market in the form, of course, of one of the linchpins of the road to revolution, the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. And that will certainly, I think, catalyze a lot of people into the patriot cause as a result. Britain's clampdown and punishment of all the tea destroyers will further sort of radicalize many protesters in America. So isn't it interesting that even though we're all well aware of how the Tea Party is a stepping stone to revolution, we've chosen to sort of crop out this sort of global trading part of the story. We've cropped out the Dutch, we've cropped out the East India Company, we've cropped out China and the Chinese peasants who farm this stuff, and we've just made this, a little domestic dispute in Boston about the price of a cup of tea. So we've missed all the global dimensions, even though they are staring us in the face. So this is one of the many ways in which I try to put the global back into the national story.
You also bring in the question of how it was popularized. I mean, certainly it's a commercial question for the elites in the New World, but you bring in the fact that they talked about how the Chinese who were providing this tea through the English were somehow poisoning it or making it bad, so that it actually hit the consumers as well. They were also against this trade. That was an interesting.
That's a great detail you've plucked out there, Greg. So when, American merchants who've been happily dealing in smuggled Dutch tea are trying to get ordinary consumers on board in their basic, boycott of East India Company tea, which is now coming over. Those American merchants, think of Hancock and friends of his who aren't merchants, like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. They are whipping up American consumers into, frankly, a xenophobic frenzy. They're spreading rumors that British East India Company tea is packed down by Chinese peasants in Canton with filthy feet who are full of diseases. This is just anti-Asian sort of hate speech, which they're using as a vehicle to attack the British East India Company. And there's sort of contemporary resonances of that sort of move, I think, in our modern era as well.
So that's the first thing why you're not going to be writing courses for PragerU, because they're just going to say this is simply we were being taxed and didn't have representation. And this is a sort of a part of the theme of your book and how you approach this. Wait a second. This was British trade monopoly. This was world economics. This was a bigger event than just a handful of yahoos dressing up and saying we don't want to be taxed
Yeah, I think all that is what you just said is true. And I'd also note for the record something we usually forget, which is that even though there have definitely been tax hikes by the British government on the colonists, think of the Stamp Act, think of the Townshend Acts, they are tax hikes. The Tea Act is not one of those things. The Tea Act lowers the price of legally imported British East India Company tea. So it's not as simple as taxation without representation. If in this particular instance your tax rate is going down, if you're willing to, play by the rules the British government is setting here. So it's much more interesting, much more complicated, much more global in scope. And everyone who opens a newspaper in Boston in the 1770s, Pat, it's full of news from India, from China. Everyone's well aware of who the British East India Company is as a global monopoly power. So the idea that it's a much more blinkered relationship is really missing much of the story.
So let's keep with this theme of this was a group of people fighting King George the Third, bad guy, horrible human being, which actually he wasn't necessarily that bad a guy, and that we everybody was united, and Britain was united to keep the colonies, and we were united to push them offshore and have our own country. And wait a second, it's a little more complicated than that. The Brits weren't completely united. We weren't united in this country. There was divisions between our native population, our black population, our enslaved black population. There was a lot more disgruntled nature of our acceptance of this as the right thing. I don't know. Did I capture that
I
fairly
think you
well?
did. I hope we'll have a chance to really unpack the questions about natives and African descended people in a bit more detail. But I'll stick to white people in this answer just for simplicity and say, yeah, the idea that it's Britons versus Americans really skates over a lot of internal divisions within those two groups. One of the chapters I have towards the end is about American loyalists and the confrontations they have, some of them verbal, some of them very physical, with American patriots, right? There's a civil war raging within America that we've chosen to forget about as we've imposed the myth of unanimity over the American people during the war, and I could talk at length about that. But in Britain too, it's the same. I think we reflexively assume that all Britons lined up behind King George, and everyone in Parliament lined up behind King George, and that King George was a half mad, hell-bent tyrant, which is the view we get from Jefferson's Declaration and the view we get from Hamilton the musical, of course, as well. Those are propaganda pieces, and I don't mean that as an insult. I do not mean that as a derogation. They're designed to persuade. Jefferson's Declaration is designed to persuade you that George is a bad guy, and it's very effective at doing that. We know from loads of scholarship by people who've examined the royal archives and read George's mail and his diary and stuff that he's pretty conflicted about whether he's making the right decision to punish the colonists for various affronts, right? He's all constantly second guessing himself. Have I been too tough? Have I been too lenient? What am I doing here? Why am I waging war against my own people? That's a fascinating revisionist account that we have, new primary sources, the chance to read George's mail to thank for that sort of thing. There's a great biography of George that came out quite recently called The Last King of America by Andrew Roberts. You may know him as a biographer of Winston Churchill, and he paints a much more conflicted picture. Definitely not the tyrant of Jefferson's Declaration. And the same goes true for everyone in Britain, right? There are real angry debates in Parliament. There are factions on both sides of the question. Is prosecuting this war to demand obedience and suppression the right move or the wrong move? Is it bad for Americans? Is it bad for British people? And, the economic repercussions in Britain of going to war against your own people in America are catastrophic for the British economy and for everyone involved in the British economy. Loads of people lose their jobs because Britain goes to war in America, for instance. And then the British people register that ambivalence. For every person who vocally supports the King's War, and there are plenty of those, there are others who vocally dissent from that war, refuse to volunteer to join the King's ranks, send in petitions begging their members of Parliament, begging the king to cease and desist and give the patriots what they want so we can resume trade and get on with our lives. We don't hear that story on this side of the Atlantic, on the American side of the Atlantic. We paint with way too broad a brush. And I think at America 250, it's time maybe to use some slightly more sensitive instruments.
Yeah. Your portrayal of King George III was the first time I've ever heard anybody talk about him with some nuance and some concern and some. I mean, he's always such a cartoonish character, and I don't know.
And in the colonies, the split, I think you talk about a split, but maybe there's different takes on that split, but I think probably 40% of people probably were neutral. I mean, didn't really have, and I think that's typical of revolutions. People have a misunderstanding of all revolutions. You know, most people are on the sidelines, and it's up to one side or the other to whip them up into a frenzy to make them decide. Is that what happened here?
Yeah, within the American population, and again, I'm focusing on white colonists in my answer. Yeah, it's a civil war. It's a battle for hearts and minds. You know, the closest we have to statistics, and you shouldn't write these down and take them to the bank, are that at the start of the war, about 40% of Americans are patriots, about 20% are loyalists, but the other 40%, as you said there, Greg, they are neither patriot nor loyalist. You can call them undecideds. You could call them neutrals. John Adams called them mongrels who won't make up their mind. Today we'd call them swing voters, actually. And there are lots of those always in America. And so this is a battle for those people in the middle, right? The patriots want those 40% in the middle to swing in their direction. The loyalists want them to swing to their direction. The loyalists know they're not going to persuade the patriots. The patriots know they're not going to persuade the loyalists, but they're playing for everyone else in the middle of the spectrum. And so there's huge sort of propaganda wars, paper wars between very skilled writers. Think of Tom Paine on the Patriot side, for instance, right, with Common Sense and the American Crisis essays, and skilled loyalist writers. I write about some of them in the book as well, who are competing for the American middle there. And we flattened all that out to assume that everyone was a patriot from the start. Everyone was lined up behind, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson or George Washington from the start, when in fact, they all knew it was a battle for hearts and minds from the beginning. And that battle extends globally as well, the battle for hearts and minds.
Well, speaking of globally, you know, in my own experience with people when we discuss the American Revolution, the thing that I think is most startling that people don't understand at all is the role of France and Spain, which you elaborate on.
Global war, global world war.
If you're going to fight a global war, then you're going to need probably a navy to do that. And Britain definitely has one. Britain has the largest navy and most powerful navy in the history of the world. And it's strangling and blockading the American patriots, right? That is the naval strategy that Britain uses, is to strangle these people into submission. And it's going pretty well. Washington is losing a lot of battles, facing massive desertions from his ranks. He's down to like 5,000 people by the Battle of Trenton in his army, which is nothing in the big scheme of things. It's heading for disaster. So what leaders like Washington, in fact, Washington himself and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, they all say, my God, if we're going to win this war, we need to not only keep at it, but we need to bring other people in to join us, right? And especially if those people bring a navy with them, that would be ideal. And who has the second largest navy in the world? France. Who has the third largest navy in the world? Spain. And guess what? If you add together the second and third largest navies, they are bigger and more powerful than Britain's Royal Navy. So getting France and Spain into the war is patriot strategy from the beginning. The Declaration of Independence is many things. And one of the things it is an invitation, a gold-plated invitation to France and Spain to come over and join us. So in that sense, it's a declaration of interdependence, if you will. And when France does finally officially join after years of sort of flirting with it, and Spain joins a year later, 1778 and 1779, the game changes. The script flips. Washington is now in the driver's seat of the war. As soon as France gets in, King George and Lord North, they are the antagonists. They're the ones being pushed around after France and Spain get into the war, because those navies, they distract Britain's armed forces in every possible way. They pull them in all these global directions. So Britain has to devote resources to the Caribbean Sea. Britain has to devote resources to the Indian Ocean, to the Mediterranean, to Britain's south coast to hold the French and Spanish back. And every resource, every soldier, every sailor, every ship that's not going to the 13 rebel colonies to strangle Washington, that's like lifting the boot off Washington's neck. And it's part of Washington's strategy to deliver that outcome.
It brings to mind counterfactual history because I think you say that Saratoga was a turning point in terms of winning the French to come in. It reminded me, of course, of the Civil War. It had a similar turning point in which Gettysburg, I think it was, is when the Brits decided they were not going to run the blockade to get cotton because the Union had turned a corner. But these counterfactual things, they leave us on a knife edge. I mean, we're really on a knife edge in terms of where things go. Correct? Is that
Yeah, I love that. I love that point. So I use the fancy SAT word, at least to myself. I don't really use it in the book. And that word is contingency, right? The idea that we don't know what's going to happen next, right? So, today we all know that the Patriots are going to win. But let me assure people listening, no one back then assumed that for a hot second. Many people hoped it, worked diligently, put their own lives at risk to deliver that outcome, but they didn't know it was going to happen. In fact, if you were a betting man or woman in 1775 or 6 or 7, and you bet the Patriots were going to win, you would get great odds at the bookies, right? They would be long odds at the bookies because no one thinks it's actually going to happen because George Washington is on the back foot. He's losing troops by the day. They're looking pretty ragged. They've run out of gunpowder after 9 months. Can you imagine that, fighting a war when you've run out of gunpowder? So where do they go for gunpowder? They go searching on the black market in the Caribbean, looking for any French island or Spanish island or Dutch island who, long before those nations weighed in officially, might be willing to sell you some gunpowder and some guns, which you can carry back to places like Saratoga. One French historian estimates that the only reason the Patriots were able to be so incredibly decisively victorious at Saratoga is because they were firing French ammunition that they'd been able to get from the French Caribbean, right? I'm not in any way minimizing the Patriots' contributions, which are exceptional throughout on the battlefield. George Washington is the right guy at the right moment, but he needs help, he needs ammo, and he knows that as well as anyone else.
And that, again, is the theme of your book, There But For This, There But For That. I mean, it could have been turned on the Native Americans' participation or not, or the percentage of black soldiers that decided to fight for Britain, or the Hessians. In fact, that might be a good place to chat. Is the Hessians? Sure. This is this weird-looking Germans with their prominent hats. They look like badasses.
It's the hats that look weird, not the Germans, just for the record. Yeah.
Right. And they're the Black Rock, kind of the Black Rock. They're they're going in and being hired as mercenaries or brought in as mercenaries. And that's a fascinating story, how they kind of got assimilated and they kind of like the American women, and half of them, some of them deserted, some didn't. I don't know. Tell us the Hessian story.
So, I think anytime we in public do talk about some of the global dimensions of the American Revolution, the way we normally do it is through France. We normally say, yeah, what about the Marquis de Lafayette, right? Maybe we're also aware that there's actual loads of French ships at the Battle of Yorktown, but it's normally through France on the Patriot side. But we could also note that the King of England is trying to build a multilateral coalition, sometimes by formal alliances with indigenous nations to ally with the king against the Patriot enemy. I'm happy to talk about that. But also by hiring tens of thousands of troops, by renting them out from various German rulers who are looking to win King George's favor. These are not individual sort of men of fortune, like, fortune hunters, like Marquis de Lafayette and Baron Steuben, who are engaged in mercenary activity. They are being sent by their rulers, whether they want to go or not, to go and fight in George's war. These are the Hessians I'm talking about. There's about 30,000 of them, which is a ton. Remember, Washington has like 5,000 dudes at Trenton. The Hessians are 30,000 strong in total by the end of the war. And King George is using the Hessians as, rent-a-cop soldiers to fling at the Patriots in what we could call now a troop surge, if you remember sort of the David Petraeus era, right? A troop surge, trying to overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers of combatants. And we know a ton about the experience of the war for those German renter troops because many of them were literate. Many of them wrote about their experiences afterwards, albeit in German usually. And so there's been great scholarship by people who speak German, like Frederica Baer at Penn State, who wrote this terrific book. It's about 500 pages long about the Hessian experience during the war. And, I leaned on that sort of scholarship to try to remind readers of my book that, without the Hessian troop surge, George wouldn't have been able to wage this war in the way he wanted and intended earlier on. He, too, is reaching out and seeking help, creating global partnerships, some of them ideological, some of them economic, I think, in this case, and flinging everything they can at the North American theater. And then some of those Hessians choose to stay behind in America, as you pointed out, Pat, after the war, either because they've chosen to desert or because their prince won't pay to take them back to Germany. And so we see, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000 former Hessian soldiers settle in the United States, especially in Pennsylvania, and they often marry local German-American women who've been there for generations. And one little interesting tidbit is, before we had the Star-Spangled Banner, which became, I think, the national anthem sometime in the 1930s, the official anthem before that, maybe unofficial is the right word, was Hail Columbia. Some of you may know Hail Columbia. That was originally written as a tune called the President's March in the 1780s to celebrate General Washington. And it was written by a former Hessian soldier who'd settled and naturalized as an American citizen. Isn't it wild? We have the first national anthem connection to the global dimensions of the American War.
And that's a happy story about people involved in the revolution on the side of one or the other. But you tell the story of all the other people that contributed so much, the Native American, African, the other folks, even the Spanish and French, who in the end all get screwed by the French and also by the Spanish.
Yeah, it's incredibly surprising, isn't it? That at the end of the war, some people get screwed over. Who's heard that before? I've certainly heard that before in many other places and many other times, and it's often Britain doing the screwing over. In this case, Britain and the US are both screwing over different sets of allies at the peace talks in 1783. I would argue that US peace commissioners led by Franklin are deeply uninterested in serving France's needs and Spain's interests in the peace treaty, and they're sent there by the US to get the best deal for the US, and they do as they're told, and they get an astonishing deal for the US out of Britain, by the way. Britain, too, however, I think screws over some of its allies. And I'm sorry to use such sort of pointed language of screwed over here. But if you are one of Britain's many indigenous allies, one of the more than a dozen native groups that sign formal military alliances with the king to push the Patriots back and serve the king's interests in the war, you might expect to get something, at least, in the global peace treaty. Even though Britain's the loser, you'd expect Britain to recognize your interests, offer you protection, maybe reparations, whatever it might be. Britain does none of that. Britain does not invite any indigenous actors or partners to the global peace talks in 1783, and the peace treaty that they signed with the United States does not mention indigenous people once, and yet what Britain has done in that treaty is effectively traded away all indigenous allies' land to the United States. The United States will expand its borders from the Appalachian Mountains, which are about, 300 miles inland, to the Mississippi, which is, about 1,000 miles inland. And what is between Appalachia and the Mississippi is Indian country, is Native America. And those lands are traded away by Britain. It has no right to trade those lands. It trades them anyway. So there are plenty of, for lack of a better word, losers at the peace table, not just Britain. Britain's arguably, and this is going to fry people's minds, Britain's arguably one of the winners in the peace talks.
We think of Columbus kind of screwing things up, coming into the, and doctrine of discovery, but the Revolutionary War was a disaster for Native Americans, and there were factions. You mentioned the Molly Brant was a Mohawk leader and very powerful, and they we don't often get clear stories about how bad the situation turned out for them. I guess that's part of American history, but
So, Pat, this is complicated stuff, and telling it, in a way that's hopefully accessible and interesting to general readers is definitely a challenge. So, what I tried to do with the chapter about Native America and the whole Trans-Appalachian West as a major theater of war is going to use one person to try to illuminate that story. It's a name you've been using, Molly Brant. This is her English language name, of course. She has a Mohawk name as well. And she is a Mohawk woman who, for various personal and political reasons, is very sympathetic to the British cause, the British side of things at the start of the American Revolution, and makes it her business to persuade other Mohawks and other members of the larger Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee people, to ally with King George against the Patriots. And as she sees it, I think correctly, the Patriots in the West, at least, are interested in possessing Mohawk lands, possessing Haudenosaunee lands, and siding with the king is the best strategy she and other natives can think of to try to prevent that from happening. I'm not saying the king is a reliable ally. It turns out to be deeply unreliable, but he's the lesser of two evils, perhaps, as Molly Brant might have seen it at the time. And so she works very hard to keep this alliance between the British government and the Haudenosaunee together during the war. The Patriots try to fracture that alliance and pull natives towards their side for obvious reasons. Native war fighters play critical roles in the American war itself. According to one statistic, about a third of Washington's army is bogged down fighting native allies of King George at one point in 1779. And George Washington's famous Sullivan campaign in 1779 is an attempt to obliterate Britain's native allies in certain parts of the theater. So this is dire stuff for indigenous people like Molly Brant. And when Britain loses, Britain leaves. And that leaves the king's former indigenous allies fighting on alone against the Patriots. Now the US government entering a new phase in sort of indigenous possibilities. And it's a dark phase for Molly Brant. She ends up as a refugee. She ends up as an exile in British Canada, and spends the last 10 years of her life trying to get King George to come back and finish the job. And as far as he's concerned, Molly Brant is dead to him by then.
Well, contra Eric Hobsbawm, who said that the U.S. Revolution was not inspirational really to the rest of the world, unlike the French Revolution. The American Revolution inspired people in India and China and other places, did it not?
It did, Greg. Yeah, I'm not going to tackle, Eric Hobsbawm. I admire his scholarship a great deal here, but I will say that it shouldn't be a pissing contest which revolution made the greatest impact, right? That's not a game I'm interested in playing here. But I will say that the American Revolution is a geopolitical earthquake of global significance. And I try and make my case through narrative and stories and people in the book. We could see the ripple effects in Ireland, for instance, where plenty of Irish protesters angry about British oppression in Ireland use the distractions of Britain's war in America to seek better conditions, better terms from the British government in London and succeed by the end of the war. And a decade later, will actually wage a full-scale independence war against the British Crown in Ireland in 1798, which is only brutally suppressed when the British Crown sends in Lord Cornwallis, for God's sake, the loser at Yorktown, to have another crack at a subjugated people. And this time he refuses to take defeat as a response, and he's brutal. We can see the same thing in India, of course, where the kingdom of Mysore, led by a Muslim prince named Hyder Ali, tries to use the distractions of Britain's war in America to boot the British out of India, out of Madras, out of Bombay, out of Calcutta, to use their 18th century names. And the French are on his side, and it looks like things are going well. And then the war ends, and France walks away, leaving Mysore unable to take on the British East India Company on its own. And eventually Lord Cornwallis appears again, this time working for the British East India Company, and puts the boot in once more. So we can see both things simultaneously here. We can see two things simultaneously. One, we can see anti-imperial, sometimes anti-British, sometimes anti-Spanish, anti-imperial revolutionaries try it, while the American revolutionaries are trying it as well. And we can also see the suppression of those efforts by the British Empire and the Spanish Empire, who do not want to see the successful ripple effects of American independence ripple around the world immediately. They try to put the genie back into the bottle, Greg. So I write about both those impulses, liberty and authority, both on the march at once.
No, we've got the native population, Irish population, German population. Let's talk about black
Great.
population. And start by telling the Peggy Cannon story. That's a great story.
So yeah,
It's almost Halloween, and this is a perfect Halloween story. Tell us about Peggy Cannon.
so I'm going to jump ahead. It's actually Paddy Cannon. So Paddy Cannon, I'm
Patty.
going to jump ahead to the 1820s, and this is my last book, folks. My book Stolen, which I'm hugely
Right.
proud of. I'm glad Pat gave me the chance to talk about her. She is a white lady in her 60s living in Delaware in the 1820s, and she runs a kidnapping gang who make their money kidnapping free black folk, often
Right.
kids from northern cities like Philly, even Baltimore, actually, who are legally free as you and me, Pat and Greg, right? But ripping up their freedom papers, dragging them away, throwing them in the back of the van, and driving that van, and vans don't exist in the 1820s, down to Mississippi and selling these people as slaves. Completely illegal, but also widespread. And so that book's about the fragility of black freedom in the 1820s. If we could scroll back to the Revolutionary era, we could say, that black liberty is, of course, under assault in the American Revolution as well, because the American Revolution exists under the umbrella of American slavery, which has been around for a long time by 1775. We know from the 1619 Project that the first enslaved Africans appeared in Virginia, Port Comfort, in 1619. Slavery is well established when the war breaks out. And enslaved people see the outbreak of war between, the Patriots and the British as the best news they've had in a while, because it creates chaos in the colonies. And chaos is distraction, and distraction is opportunity. So enslaved people by the thousand flee their enslavers, liberate themselves, and many of them, go to the British Army and say, "What could we do for you in return for your military protection of us?" And the British Army, much like the U.S. Army in the Civil War, Greg, see an opportunity here that they hadn't foreseen, right? If we take in fugitives from patriot slavery, we are screwing with the patriots. We're screwing with their economy. We're screwing with their households. We're screwing with their lines of authority. So let's do it. And they do it. By the end of the war, we think that about, 25,000 formerly enslaved individuals have fled from patriot masters like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and made their way to British lines. And the question becomes, what's going to happen at the end of the war? All these formerly enslaved individuals, including a guy who used to be enslaved by George Washington, whose name is Harry. Harry hopes that Britain will win and that Britain will keep its promises of lifelong freedom. But then Britain loses. Britain loses badly in the war. And so what are going to happen to these promises of lifelong freedom that commanders on the ground have made to all these black fugitives? That's a really open question. I said a few minutes ago in response to another question that Britain screws over some of its allies at the peace table. One of the groups it screws over are black fugitives who've come to fight for the British side during the war. There is language in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, put there by an American slave trader named Henry Lawrence, and signed off on by a British slave trader named Richard Oswald, that says black fugitives sheltering behind British lines in New York, Charleston, Savannah, they cannot leave when Britain evacuates. They must stay so they can be re-enslaved by enslavers like Washington and Jefferson looking for their runaway slaves. That is a nightmare scenario for someone like Harry Washington, right, who's tried to wiggle free of George Washington and build a new life where he governs his own life. So something extraordinary happens on the streets of New York in 1783. Black fugitives like Harry get wind of the terms of the treaty that's coming down, and they lobby they lobby British commanders on the ground in New York to cut them a better deal than the global treaty that diplomats have just signed in Paris. And they persuade the British commander on the ground in New York, his name is Guy Carleton, to evacuate them, to take them with him when he leaves to British Nova Scotia. To be clear again, folks, this is against the terms of the treaty Guy Carleton's own government has just signed. So Guy Carleton is going rogue under pressure from black fugitives to do so, but he does so. And I think they play him like a fiddle. They push all his buttons. And so 3,000 of them evacuate with the Royal Navy to British Nova Scotia, and they do get legal freedom there. Though they find out that's all they get. They don't get meaningful equality and equal protection under the law or a path to property or anything like that, or 40 acres and a mule, but they are free. So the question then becomes, well, is that enough, or does freedom require actual civil rights? And that's what leads about 1,500 of these black refugees, including Harry, to eventually abandon British Nova Scotia and seek refuge in a new British colony set up supposedly just for them in Sierra Leone. And that doesn't turn out to be a picnic either. And by 1800, Pat, as you know, Harry Washington will be leading an anti-British war of independence in Sierra Leone. There's a wild story for you. Where's the HBO movie about that?
It reminds me of Greg and I are old Vietnam War protesters, and all of our buddies went to Canada. I mean, it's the same thing. You know, when your conscientious objector status is gone, and off to Canada, and now, but the Harry story of him turning around full circle and ending up fighting the Brits in the end is a great story too.
Yeah, George is not the only Washington seeking independence.
How much time do you spend in libraries, traveling, looking for obscure letters or court records? It must be that intermittent reinforcement that gets gamblers to be addicted. I mean,
oh my Lord,
when you come across something and you go, holy cow, you can't believe what I just found.
So you're calling it a pathology. Being a historian is a pathology, right?
Skinner's
historian.
rat, variable reinforcement schedule.
Yeah.
It's just basic, psychology. You get that
So,
big dopamine hit.
I think you're probably onto something here. I would say my last book, Stolen, that took me 10 years, and I traveled to 35 archives in 14 different states and the District of Columbia, and doing that archival sort of shoe leather work was a labor of love and also very time consuming and very frustrating. That's what doing history is like on the front lines. This project, the one we're talking about today, the American Revolution and the Fate of the World, I had some advantages here. And the advantages was this is a synthesis. This is what we call sort of me wrapping my arms around different bodies of research done by other expert scholars who've each put in their 10 years, right? So I'm reading all the recent scholarship on Hessians, think of the work of Frederica Bayer, and saying, what can I pull from this, which, sort of platforms this research and brings it to a wider audience. So what's interesting about my book is I didn't get to travel anywhere fun for this book as well. I went to College Park, Maryland, and that's where I live to write this book. But Maryland University, where I teach, has a great research library with every meaningful piece of scholarship put out by a reputable scholar in the last 100 years. So I can go live in that library and learn things I didn't know. But fundamentally, I'm pulling together, this book has 14 chapters, I'm pulling together 14 separate literatures which are don't normally get to talk to each other, and putting them next to each other and say, guess what? When you put these 14 different literatures, one about what's happening in Ireland in the 1780s, one about what's happening in India in the 1770s, when you put them next to each other, they start to talk to each other, and you see connections and themes that these 14 different bodies of literature might not have seen without me forcing them together. So I think this book, which is built on very impressive parts by other scholars, also says something new and original that's not previously been said, because no one's put these literatures into proximity before.
Well, I think you synthesized the teacher-scholar divide. I mean, anyone that's been in college, university, has suffered through a scholar who didn't want to teach. And so the material was just boring as hell. And then the other side, you've met great, brilliant teachers who really get you excited, but they really don't give you a lot. Just kind of you put them together in a nice way. I mean, the passion you bring to this discussion, I'm sure is in shared with your students, and they're very, very, very fortunate.
Right.
But you bring it to your book, and I think that's really a real achievement to bring that kind of
Thank you, Jay.
passion.
That's very kind of you. All I will say in response is, is that, this is genuinely fascinating to me, and I've spent several years with it now, as you can imagine. And my goal in writing this was to teach myself things I didn't know, to master literatures I had not mastered before this, and then try to, for lack of a better word, to teach them to other people who read the book, right? To introduce them to people who read the book. And that's an exciting challenge. That's an honor to be responsible for delivering other people's decades of research in a way that, does it accurately and fairly, but also in an accessible way. It's also really hard to try to write what I'm going for here, to try to put people-centered stories at the center of each chapter. So to cover, 8 years and 2,000 square miles of indigenous history through the life of one woman is a writing challenge, which I've embraced, and we'll see how what people think of it. To tell the story of Black refugees through Harry Washington. There's three other characters who get their own chapters. Baron Steuben, the Prussian drill master, being perhaps the most famous, but also a Boston school teacher who ends up as a Patriot licensed pirate and ends up in British black holes, black sites in various parts of the British Empire, and a woman named Peggy Shippen Arnold, who, as her last name suggests, is the wife of Benedict Arnold, and is arguably the person who suggests treason to him. And then once he commits to his new wife's idea, the whole family pays a huge price, of course, when that blows up in everyone's face. And they spend the rest of their lives in exile in London, in Canada. And she dreams of sending her kids, who all have the last name Arnold, to go be in the British military in India, right? So again, globe-trotting odysseys expressed through one family.
Well, it's a
Well,
great anecdote to mythology. I mean, the mythology that we grew up with. I mean, you're not I gather you're not native born, as Pat
How
and
dare you? How dare you?
accent kind of gives it away a bit, but we that are native born, I mean, we've been spoon fed this mythology, particularly those growing up in the Cold War era, because that's when you're glorifying American history. And this is a great antidote. I don't think it's an ideological work. I
yeah,
don't. I'm sure you have an ideology, but it does dispel the myth, and I think in this forthcoming 250th anniversary, it's going to be really, really welcome. It's really great timing because it'll maybe make people think about these events, and so much of it is tragic. I mean,
Yeah.
not to stress that side of it, but really, you tell some very tragic stories here, and
Yeah, I agree. There is triumph and tragedy in roughly equal measure, I would say. And I'm definitely not interested in sort of grinding a partisan axe in this book. This book is about the past. It tries to take the past on its own terms. But it does remind us that it's never, from the beginning, it was never America alone. It was always America among from the start. And we've been entangled as a people. I say we because I'm actually a US citizen, despite this fake British accent I'm doing for you today. That we in America have been entangled with the rest of the world from the beginning. And we shouldn't artificially separate out American history from world history, right? Because that's not what the Patriots tried to do in the war. They tried to bring the world into the war.
well, I'd like to close by talking about me. Um, you mentioned Lord Sandwich. I just have to tell you that in 1958, my dad was stationed in Alconbury, England, which is north of Cambridge, and we lived for quite some time in Hinchinbrook Castle, which is housed, I think, 9 Earl of Sandwiches. And I used to play in the dungeon and out in the stables, and so I'm just letting you know that. Have you been to Hinchinbrook Castle before, or Hinchinbrook House now?
I've been to Alconbury, I think, because I grew up just on the other side of Cambridge, just south of Cambridge, in a town called Bishop's Stortford, which has
Okay.
only two claims to fame, Pat, and neither of them are glorious, I'll tell you that right now. The first claim to fame is it's home to London's third airport, which is the worldwide headquarters of Ryanair, the notoriously cheap low-cost airline. My town is always full of air stewards and stewardesses walking around in uniform. It's a very strange place. And then my town's also famous, more tragically, I think, as being the birthplace of Cecil Rhodes, who's not in my book, but he is the guy who I think, exploits Africa in the later 19th century, which is a reminder to folks that the American Revolution and the loss of 13 colonies is definitely a setback for the British Empire, but it's not a death blow by any stretch of the imagination. The British Empire will regroup and try, sometimes fail, but certainly try to learn lessons from the revolution to make sure it doesn't lose colonies in the future, but it actually plants more flags elsewhere. And Cecil Rhodes is the evil sort of apotheosis of that impulse, I think. And he's from my town.
Well, when we were trying to get base housing, we lived in a small town, Pilton, UK, which is where the Glastonbury festival is. The largest festival in Europe is there now, but it was
Oh,
only nine.
Glastonbury. Yeah, the big music festival.
Glaston,
Yeah.
yeah, and it was only it's just a small little teeny town, and my dad shipped over a Buick, a big Buick car, which was you couldn't drive on the roads. You just literally couldn't go down these
Because it was a
roads.
yacht. You brought a yacht to a small
Brought a
country
yacht, so he had it. He shipped it over, had it for a month, and then shipped it back with somebody that was coming back to the States. So anyway, I've got dear friends and dear friends still there, and I have a lot of acquaintances, and it's wonderful place, wonderful place. So, hey, thanks. This is fun. Any last comments, Greg? Anything before we go?
Well, I think we've been effusive in our praise. I just would want to say that it's sincere. I mean, we've had a lot of guests on, and I think you make history enjoyable. And I like history, so I'm going to read good, bad, and indifferent histories. But I think you're a gift to people who aren't familiar with this history because you present it so well, and it's so edible. I mean, you can just really gobble it up, these
Right.
stories, and they resonate and you remember them. As I mentioned earlier, I had to reread your book because such a gap between when we talked about you being on and when you were on. But it was a great pleasure. It's even greater pleasure to hear you tell these stories. I think we
Yeah.
probably left the Caribbean out, regrettably, but
People should go buy the book to find out what happens.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
That's
we
a
left out a
teaser. That's a
lot.
teaser. We didn't
We
talk
left out
about
a
the
lot.
Caribbean.
Very
Yeah,
clever, very
that's a
clever. Yeah,
pity.
I'm really proud of this book, but I wrote this book to educate myself and then share that with as many other people as possible. So thanks for sharing my
All right,
curiosity about what
good.
makes the
Thank you.
revolution so interesting.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll have a lot of fun next July when this is going to be such a big deal. So, all right. Bye now. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.